Los Angeles, the Forum, summer 1983. The California heat pressed down on the sprawling parking lot like a physical weight, creating shimmering mirages above the asphalt ocean of vehicles. Inside the legendary arena, the temperature climbed even higher, 30,000 bodies generating their own weather system of excitement, anticipation, and barely contained frenzy. This wasn't just any concert. This was the finale of the Off the Wall Meets Street Songs charity event, a week-long music festival bringing together the biggest stars of funk, soul, and pop to raise money for music education in underfunded schools across America. The lineup had been stellar throughout the week, but tonight promised something special. Michael Jackson and Rick James, two of music's most electrifying performers, sharing the same stage for the first time. Backstage, the atmosphere crackled with tension. In one dressing room, Michael Jackson sat perfectly still, eyes closed in meditation as his team made final adjustments to his outfit. A custom-designed jacket adorned with crystals that caught the light with every movement. His stillness was that of a vessel conserving energy, preparing to transform it into the superhuman performance his audiences had come to expect. 3 doors down, in a considerably more chaotic space, Rick James prowled like a caged panther, his signature beaded braids swinging with each agitated step. Where Michael prepared through stillness, Rick channeled his pre-show energy in a movement, in a constant motion that seemed to electrify the very air around him. 20 minutes, called a harried-looking production assistant through the half-open door. Rick nodded sharply, then turned to his personal manager who sat in the corner, watching his client's restless trajectory across the room. "Is he still doing it?" Rick asked, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "The moonwalk." The manager shifted uncomfortably. "That's what I heard from the tech guys. It's in the set list for tonight." Rick's expression darkened. "That's Buffalo style, man. That's my move. I've been doing that since he was still singing about ABC and 123. The manager said nothing. This was an old grievance, one that had been simmering for months since Michael had debuted the moonwalk to worldwide acclaim on the Motown 25th anniversary special. Rick had been vocal in industry circles about his belief that Michael had appropriated the move from him, specifically from his performances in Buffalo, New York years earlier. What had begun as professional frustration had calcified into something harder, something that threatened to overshadow the charitable purpose of tonight's event. "I should say something," Rick muttered, more to himself than to his manager. "Not tonight, Rick," the manager said, his tone caught between placation and warning. "Tonight's about the kids, about the charity. The press would have a field day, if what?" Rick interrupted, turning to face him fully. "If I stand up for what's mine? If I don't let myself be erased from my own story?" The manager sighed, recognizing the set of Rick James' jaw, the gleam in his eyes that signaled a mind already made up. "Just remember why we're here," he said finally. Out in the arena, the anticipation had built to almost unbearable levels. The audience, a mix of hardcore Rick James fans, devoted Michael Jackson followers, and music lovers who appreciated both artists, created a constant roar of excitement that rose and fell like ocean waves. The festival's organizer, a veteran music producer who had worked with both performers, paced nervously at the side of the stage. He had intentionally scheduled Rick to perform first, followed by Michael, with a carefully orchestrated joint finale that would, in theory, bring these two very different artists together in harmony for the cause. But the whispers had reached him too, rumors of Rick's growing frustration, of potential confrontation. The house lights dimmed, and the crowd's roar crescendoed. A single spotlight illuminated the center of the stage as the opening notes of "Give It to Me, Baby" exploded from the sound system. Rick James materialized in the spotlight as if conjured by the music itself, his presence instantly commanding the massive space. Where some performers needed time to warm up, to build their energy gradually, Rick arrived at full power, a human lightning bolt striking the stage with devastating impact. For the next 45 minutes, he owned the arena completely. His performance was raw, unfiltered, primal in its energy, yet sophisticated in its musicality. He prowled the stage like a predator, his connection with the audience so immediate and visceral that even those who had come primarily to see Michael found themselves swept up in the tornado of funk that Rick James had unleashed. Throughout his set, Rick's dancing included elements that keen-eyed observers would recognize as precursors to what had now become known worldwide as the moonwalk. Each time he executed one of these moves, a knowing murmur rippled through certain sections of the audience, those familiar with Rick's history, with his claim to the move's origins. Toward the end of his performance, Rick paused to address the audience directly, his chest rising and falling with exertion, sweat glistening on his face. "Thank you all for coming out tonight to support music education," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the arena. "Music saved my life as a kid in Buffalo. It gave me a language when words failed, gave me a purpose when the world seemed empty." The crowd responded with appreciative cheers and applause. Rick nodded, seeming to make a decision in that moment. "Tonight isn't about any one performer," he continued. "It's about recognizing where we come from, about honoring our influences, about acknowledging the shoulders we stand on." There was something in his tone, an edge, a weight to his words that suggested layers of meaning beyond the charitable sentiment. Those familiar with the brewing tension between him and Michael exchanged glances, sensing that Rick was building towards something unplanned. But the moment passed without further comment. Rick launched into his final number, the energy building to an explosive conclusion that left the audience on their feet, screaming for more. He took his bows, the consummate showman, to the end, then disappeared into the darkness at the side of the stage as the house lights came up slightly for the transition to the next act. The festival organizer intercepted him immediately. "Great set, Rick, really fantastic," he said, his smile genuine but his eyes watchful. Rick nodded, accepting a towel from an assistant and wiping his face. "Michael's up next," the organizer continued, his tone carefully neutral. "Then you both come back out for the finale. Everything good with that plan?" Rick draped the towel around his neck, his expression unreadable. "Everything's perfect," he said finally, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The organizer watched him walk toward his dressing room, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. On the other side of the stage, Michael Jackson was completing his final preparations, surrounded by his team, but essentially alone in his focus. He had watched portions of Rick's performance on a monitor, his expression giving nothing away as he observed the moves that echoed his own famous moonwalk, or, as some would argue, as he observed the moves that his moonwalk echoed. Now, as the moment approached for his own entrance, he closed his eyes briefly, centering himself in the quiet eye of the hurricane that was about to be unleashed. 2 minutes, Michael," his manager said softly. Michael nodded, rolling his shoulders gently, loosening muscles that would soon be called upon to perform at the very edge of human capability. The house lights dimmed again, plunging the arena into darkness so complete that the collective intake of breath from 30,000 people was not just heard but felt. The opening synthesizer notes of Billie Jean shimmered through the darkness, and the audience erupted in anticipation. A single beam of light found Michael at the back of the stage, his silhouette unmistakable. The fedora, the glove, the lean silhouette poised like a dancer frozen between movements. What followed was quintessential Michael Jackson, a performance so precise yet so passionate, so technically perfect yet so emotionally authentic that the line between rehearsed choreography and spontaneous expression blurred into irrelevance. Every movement told a story. Every gesture contained worlds of meaning. The audience responded as if to a religious experience, with the kind of unrestrained emotional release rarely seen outside of moments of collective ecstasy or grief. Midway through his set, the opening notes of Billie Jean returned, a reprise that the audience immediately recognized as the prelude to the moonwalk. The reaction was seismic, 30,000 people rising as one in anticipation of the move that had transformed dance forever. Michael executed it flawlessly, seeming to defy gravity as he slid backward across the stage while appearing to walk forward. The audience's response was deafening, a wall of sound that physically vibrated the massive structure of the forum. And then, something unexpected happened. As the cheers for the moonwalk reached their crescendo, a figure emerged from the side of the stage, stepping deliberately into Michael's spotlight. Rick James, who should have been in his dressing room preparing for the joint finale, was walking directly toward Michael Jackson in the middle of his set. The audience's roar shifted in tone, confusion mingling with excitement at this unplanned development. Security personnel at the edges of the stage tensed, uncertain whether to intervene in what was clearly a deviation from the carefully orchestrated program. The band, consummate professionals, continued playing, though several members exchanged alarmed glances. Michael himself showed only the briefest flicker of surprise before his face resumed its performance mask, though he stopped dancing, turning to face the approaching figure. Rick James stopped a few feet away from Michael, close enough for conversation, but maintaining a distance that didn't suggest immediate physical threat. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, two icons at the peak of their powers, surrounded by 30,000 witnesses holding their collective breath. The music faded slightly as the sound engineer made a split-second decision to lower the backing track, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Rick raised his hand, and against all expectations, he was holding a microphone. Someone in his team had ensured his words would be heard throughout the arena. The festival organizer, watching in horror from the side of the stage, made a frantic cutting motion across his throat to the sound engineer, but it was too late. "Michael Jackson, ladies and gentlemen," Rick said, his voice carrying across the now-hushed arena. "The world's biggest star, the man who can do no wrong." There was something in his tone, not quite sarcasm, but an edge that made the audience tense. Security began moving more deliberately toward the stage, but still held back, reluctant to create an even more dramatic scene by physically removing Rick James mid-sentence. "That move you just did," Rick continued, gesturing toward the spot where Michael had executed the moonwalk moments before. "That beautiful, gravity-defying move that the whole world is talking about. I've got something to say about that." The tension in the arena was palpable. 30,000 people seemed to be holding their breath simultaneously. Michael remained still, his expression giving nothing away, though those closest to the stage later reported seeing his hand tighten almost imperceptibly around his microphone. "I've been doing that move since you were a child, Michael," Rick said, his voice carrying both challenge and what seemed like genuine hurt. "Buffalo style. That's what we called it back in the day. That's my history, my culture, my contribution. And now the whole world thinks you invented it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Confusion, tension, the collective uncertainty of witnesses to an unscripted confrontation between music royalty. Michael remained silent, his stillness almost supernatural in its completeness. The festival organizer had now made his way onto the stage, hovering at its edge, clearly torn between intervention and allowing whatever was unfolding to reach its natural conclusion. Rick took a step closer to Michael, and for a brief, terrible moment, it seemed that the confrontation might escalate beyond words. The security personnel began moving more purposefully now, but before they could reach the center of the stage, Rick's expression changed. The hardness in his eyes softened, and he shook his head slightly, as if coming to some private conclusion. "I could be angry about that," he continued, his tone shifting subtly. "I could stand here in front of all these people and demand credit, demand recognition." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces watching in fascinated silence. "But that's not why we're here tonight, is it? We're here for the kids. We're here because music saved us, and we wanted to save others too." The tension in the arena began to transform, uncertainty giving way to a different kind of anticipation. Michael, still silent, watched Rick with an intensity that seemed to look straight through to his soul. "The truth is," Rick said, turning back to Michael, "nobody owns a dance move. Nobody owns music. It belongs to all of us, passed down from generation to generation, each artist adding their own spirit, their own truth to what came before." He extended his hand, palm up, in a gesture that somehow managed to be both conciliatory and challenging. "So here's what I propose, Michael Jackson. Instead of me claiming you took something from me, instead of drawing lines between your kingdom and mine, why don't we show these good people what happens when influences flow freely, when artists respect each other's contributions?" The audience began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm as they realized they were witnessing not an escalation of conflict, but its potential resolution. Michael looked at Rick's extended hand, his expression thoughtful. Then, with a grace that characterized his every movement, he stepped forward and took it. The audience erupted, relief and excitement creating a wave of sound that washed over the stage. But Michael wasn't finished with surprises. He leaned toward Rick, speaking directly into his ear rather than using his microphone, his words private between the two of them despite the 30,000 witnesses. Rick's expression shifted as he listened, surprise, then understanding, and finally something that looked remarkably like respect. Michael stepped back, nodded once to Rick, then turned to the band, making a subtle gesture that those who had worked with him immediately recognized. The music changed, the familiar beats of Billie Jean, transforming into something new yet recognizable, a fusion of Michael's pop precision and Rick's raw funk energy. And then, something extraordinary happened. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, as we continue to bring you the most extraordinary moments from the lives of musical legends. Michael began to dance, not the choreographed routine that had become his trademark, but something more organic, more spontaneous. He was incorporating elements of Rick's style, the raw sexuality, the unfiltered energy, while maintaining the fluid grace that defined his own movement. After a moment of apparent astonishment, Rick joined him, bringing his own physicality into conversation with Michael's. What unfolded over the next several minutes defied description, though those who witnessed it would spend decades trying to capture it in words. Two masters of movement, of physical expression, engaged in a dance that was part dialogue, part demonstration, part mutual acknowledgement. Michael would execute a sequence, and Rick would respond with his own interpretation. Rick would initiate a move, and Michael would transform it through his unique physical vocabulary. Neither was following the other, neither was leading. They were creating something new in the moment, something born from the tension between them, but transcending it entirely. The audience watched in a state approaching reverence, understanding intuitively that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a spontaneous collaboration between two artists whose approaches and personas could hardly have been more different, yet who were finding unexpected harmony in their differences. As the improvised performance reached its natural conclusion, Rick and Michael stood side by side, both breathing heavily from the exertion but appearing somehow energized rather than depleted. Rick raised his microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent in his initial confrontation. "This is what music education can do. This is why we're here tonight. To make sure every child has the chance to find their voice, to learn the language of rhythm and melody, to discover how much more connects us than separates us." The crowd's response was thunderous, the earlier tension completely transformed into collective joy. Michael, who had retrieved his own microphone, spoke for the first time since Rick had appeared on stage. "Rick James showed me something important tonight," he said, his voice soft yet carrying effortlessly through the now silent arena. "He reminded me that none of us creates in isolation. We all stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, those who danced before us, those who sang before us." He turned to Rick, meeting his gaze directly. "I've respected your artistry for many years," he continued. "The power you bring to every performance, the raw truth in your music. If elements of your Buffalo style found their way into my dancing, it wasn't theft, it was tribute." A ripple of appreciative murmurs moved through the crowd. Rick's expression softened further, the last vestiges of his earlier confrontational energy dissolving into something that looked remarkably like affection. "And you," he said to Michael, "took whatever influences you absorbed and created something unique, something that belongs only to you." That's how art evolves. That's how culture stays alive. What happened next would be described in countless magazine articles, remembered by 30,000 witnesses, and analyzed by music historians for decades to come. Michael Jackson removed his iconic sequined glove, the symbol that had become inseparable from his public persona, and held it out to Rick James. The gesture was both simple and profound, an acknowledgement not just of Rick's influence, but of his importance as an artist in his own right. Rick looked at the glove for a long moment, understanding the significance behind the offering. Then, with a grin that transformed his features, he reached up and removed one of his beaded braids, carefully clipping it from near the scalp with a small pair of scissors produced from his pocket. He held it out to Michael, a reciprocal offering of identity, of persona, of artistic signature. They made the exchange there on stage, Michael carefully tucking the braid into his jacket pocket, Rick slipping on the glove with a theatrical flourish that made the audience laugh and cheer. Then, in perfect unison, though, with no visible signal passing between them, they both turned to the audience and bowed deeply. A gesture of respect, not just for each other, but for the witnesses to this unexpected moment of reconciliation and mutual recognition. The planned finale of the charity event, the joint performance that had been carefully choreographed and rehearsed, was abandoned in favor of something more authentic. Rick and Michael simply shared the stage for another 30 minutes, trading songs, joining in on each other's choruses, creating spontaneous mashups of their most famous works. Their bands, initially thrown by the deviation from the program, quickly found their groove, professional musicians rising to the challenge of this unrehearsed collaboration. By the time the final notes faded and the house lights gradually rose, something had shifted not just between the two performers, but in the audience as well. The 30,000 people who had come expecting entertainment had received something more valuable, a glimpse of genuine human connection emerging from potential conflict, a demonstration of how artistic differences could become complementary rather than competitive. As Rick and Michael took their final bows together, their arms around each other's shoulders in a gesture of camaraderie that would have seemed impossible hours earlier, the applause that filled the forum was about more than appreciation for a performance. It was recognition of a moment of grace, a public healing, a demonstration that even the most painful misunderstandings could give way to something beautiful when approached with openness and respect. Backstage, as the audience slowly filed out of the arena, still buzzing with excitement about what they had witnessed, Rick and Michael found a quiet corner away from their respective entourages. For several minutes, they simply talked about music, about dance, about the peculiar isolation of megastardom, about the artistic influences that had shaped them both. Those who observed this private conversation from a respectful distance would later report that it had the quality of two travelers from different countries discovering they had walked similar paths. Just on opposite sides of a river, they had now found a way to cross. Before they parted ways, Rick carefully removed the sequined glove and attempted to return it to Michael. But Michael shook his head. "Keep it," he said, that childlike smile briefly illuminating his features. To remember that sometimes confrontation can lead to collaboration. Rick nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the simple statement. He reached out to reclaim his braid, but Michael placed a gentle hand over the pocket where he had stored it. "And this stays with me," he said, "to remember that every move I make carries the influence of those who moved before me." They embraced then, a gesture caught by a single photographer whose image would appear on the cover of Rolling Stone the following month under the headline, "When Kings Collide, the Night Rick James and Michael Jackson Rewrote Music History." In the days and weeks that followed, the story of what had transpired at the forum took on an almost mythical quality. Music journalists who had been present wrote about it, not just as an unexpected moment of drama, but as a demonstration of how artistic disagreements could be resolved with dignity and mutual respect. The Charity for Music Education reported record donations in the aftermath, as the story of the Confrontation turned collaboration inspired people to support the cause that had brought Rick and Michael together in the first place. Rick James, in interviews afterward, spoke with new humility about the nature of artistic influence and evolution. I still believe the Buffalo style came first, he would say with a laugh. But Michael took it to places I never imagined. That's how art works. Each generation stands on the shoulders of the one before, seeing further, reaching higher. Michael, characteristically more private about his personal reflections, said little about the encounter in public. But those closest to him noted that he began explicitly acknowledging his influences in interviews and award acceptance speeches, speaking with particular warmth about the funk and soul traditions that had informed his own artistic development. If you've enjoyed this story about an iconic moment in music history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary stories from the lives of musical legends. The glove and the braid became silent witnesses to the night's transformation. Rick was occasionally seen wearing the sequined glove during particularly significant performances, though he always made a point of acknowledging its origin and meaning. Michael, true to his word, kept the beaded braid, though it remained a private totem rather than a public statement. Years later, when a documentary filmmaker asked Rick James about that night at the Forum, his response captured the essence of what had transpired. People expected a fight, he said, his eyes distant with memory. They expected two big egos colliding like planets, creating destruction. What they got instead was two artists recognizing themselves in each other, finding common ground in their differences. That's the real power of music. It doesn't just connect the artist to the audience. It connects us to each other. The filmmaker then asked if he regretted his confrontational approach, if he wished he had handled things differently. Rick smiled, an expression of hard-earned wisdom crossing his features. Regret? No. That confrontation needed to happen. Sometimes you have to bring the darkness into the light before you can transform it into something beautiful. If I had kept that resentment bottled up, if Michael and I had maintained our public politeness while privately harboring misunderstanding, we both would have lost something valuable. Sometimes you have to risk conflict to find connection. In a music industry often characterized by competition, by carefully maintained images and strategic rivalries, the night Rick James confronted Michael Jackson on stage remains a powerful counter-narrative, a reminder that beneath the personas, the carefully constructed public faces, artists share a common humanity and a common purpose. The 30,000 fans who witnessed this transformation firsthand carried the memory with them, a testament to the possibility that even our most challenging confrontations can become opportunities for growth, for understanding, for the creation of something more beautiful than either party could have created alone. And in the end, isn't that what music at its best has always been about? Not the assertion of the individual ego, but the discovery of our shared humanity, our common rhythms, the universal language that speaks to us all, regardless of which kingdom of sound we call home.